If this is starting to sound familiar, it's because the cracks in our own system are starting to expose the underlying fragility that really has always been there. In any system that there is a public good, and as long as everyone takes only what they need, the system can continue to replenish and provide for everybody. But all it takes is one photo like this, or a single picture of one person hoarding, and now you've got yourself a full-blown tragedy of the commons, where the collective response required is so painfully obvious, and everyone's screaming, just stop hoarding, this is insane. Because again, the collective decision is obvious, and the cost of the collective decision not being made is also obvious. So everybody is aware of what's about to happen, but nobody's able to stop it, because at an individual level, for every individual, the logic goes something like this. If everyone else is hoarding, and I also hoard, then yes, the system's going to crash, but at least I won't be without toilet paper. And if everyone else is responsible and only continues to only take what they need, then the system won't crash. So my small amount of cheating isn't going to crash the system all by itself, and this way I have a little bit of extra toilet paper and don't have to worry as much as everybody else does. Advantage gained. So once again, regardless of what everyone else does, my best option as an individualist is to cheat. Bring on the hoarding. And suddenly the shelves are empty. This is also the result of the tragedy of the commons. We've seen it with baseball players when they think, if nobody else is cheating and I cheat, that gives me an advantage. If everybody else is cheating and I cheat, that prevents me from having a disadvantage. So either way, my best option as an individualist is to cheat. Or what about when the socially responsible behavior and the socially necessary behavior as a collective approach is to not leave your house? If I stay home and everyone else stays home, great, we end the pandemic. But if everyone else goes out and I also go out, then yes, the pandemic is not averted, but at least I'm not at a disadvantage. If everyone else stays home, I go out, then I gain the benefit of the crisis being averted, and my single act of going out isn't going to crash the whole system, so I gain an advantage by not losing all my normal life as much as everybody else. The tragedy of the commons is what makes global warming such a uniquely difficult problem to solve, because that conflict between social responsibility and personal benefit exists at every single level. At the personal level, if everyone else switches to renewable energy sources and I don't, then I gain all the benefits without making any personal sacrifices. And if everyone else clings to their energy-consuming ways, then disaster is going to ensue anyway, so at least this way I'm not at a disadvantage. At an individual level, no matter what everyone else does, it's in my personal best interest to continue using whatever cheap energy I can and acting socially irresponsible. At a corporate level, the same dilemma exists. If all the other corporations switch to cleaner energy and I stick with oil, then I get the benefits of avoiding a climate disaster, and I get the personal benefits of continuing to use cheap energy and not having to actually put any self-sacrifice into the system. And if all the other corporations stick with oil, then if I continue to use oil, it's all going to get used up and we're going to have a climate disaster, but at least I'm not in a disadvantage for the time being. It's getting repetitive, I know. And at a national level, the exact same problem exists. If other nations continue to be environmentally destructive, then our planet is headed for disaster anyways, so we might as well not be disadvantaged in the moment. But if everyone else is responsible and actually helps avert the climate disaster, then my country gains an advantage by not putting anything into that effort. So once again, while the collective action is obvious and the disaster of doing so is obvious and painful for everybody, that collective action can't be accomplished through individualistic responses, because at an individual level and at a corporate level and at a national level, it's always a conflict between personal interest and social responsibility. And everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too. So everyone wants to avoid global warming, everyone wants to avoid the negative effects of global warming, but it's in everybody's personal best interest to not actually put any personal effort into that, to not make any personal sacrifices. And now this dilemma has really hit home because we're facing the consequences of it in our everyday lives. And the crises that we're facing right now, the shortages that we're facing right now, are relatively trivial compared to what's coming. In many places, we're seeing shortages of hospital beds, and that's going to only become more common, as well as who gets ventilators and who doesn't. So, like, what the hell? How do we stop this from happening? How do we protect ourselves from this happening? Well, let's go back to the field. Let's go back to the bar when they made the decision to reduce grazing from 3 days to 2 days. Now, instead of just relying on everybody to do this, they could appoint somebody to be a lawmaker of sorts. So, barkeep, you up for it? Hell yeah, he is. So the newly appointed sheriff monitors the field and makes sure that nobody cheats, everyone follows the agreed upon rules, and this allows sustainability, and they weather the drought. This is the socialist solution that continues to treat the field as a common good that everyone has equal rights to. It works incredibly effectively to avoid the worst outcomes of the tragedy of the commons. So if this system is so great at preventing tragedies and stopping the collapse of the entire system, why did most of you cringe when I just said socialism? Well, their strengths are avoiding collapse and weathering tough times. But when times are good, the oversight starts to feel unnecessary.
I don't know why we keep paying the sheriff to be out here. He ain't doing shit. Freeloader.
And the benefits of tolerable cheating that certain individuals had come to be accustomed to can no longer continue with supervision. And indeed, while the very authoritarian approach is necessary to manage a crisis, to maintain that same level of authoritarianism in a time of abundance, it would be silly, and also it would unnecessarily waste resources, because when you do have a surplus of resources, if you're still strictly enforcing those authoritarian rules, then that surplus goes to waste. But to be fair to the sheriff/barkeep, he was kind of thrust into this role unexpectedly and suddenly, so he can't be expected to be completely perfect at the job. It can be tempting to just say that we should get rid of the sheriff when we're no longer in a state of crisis, that once the state of crisis is over, we no longer need supervision, we no longer need oversight, we no longer need top-down authority. But the problem with that is that the initial tragedy of the commons was triggered not directly by the drought, which only exposed the fragility of the system. It was triggered directly by the collective realization of each individual that their individual interests were in direct conflict with the social interest. So once people are aware of that, it can be triggered really anytime. As we know, it only takes the perception of a shortage to trigger the tragedy of the commons and trigger selfish behavior, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So oversight is necessary at all times, especially once the fragility of the system has been exposed. It's really hard to go back to a system with less oversight, because people will, again, once people are aware of the fragility of the system, it triggers the tragedy of the commons thinking and that dilemma between social responsibility and personal advantage. Top-down authority like this is absolutely vital, necessary, and the only way to avert the disaster of the tragedy of the commons. But in times of abundance, it can still be a useful system to make sure that a tragedy of the commons isn't triggered, but also to distribute the resources effectively and fairly. So when there is an abundance, the sheriff doesn't need to enforce the rules with the same level of rigidity. He can monitor the production and note whether the production is particularly low or particularly high, and adjust the enforcement of the rules based on the level of production of the common good. But I think he might need some help with that. So he goes ahead and hires intelligence. We give him somebody who can monitor the field and report to him and say, hey, this is what level of production we're at right now, so this is the level of grazing you can allow for each individual. And rather than those surpluses benefiting only a few, and specifically the few who are more inclined to cheating, the top-down distribution of goods assures that everybody gets an equal benefit from the time of surplus. And this system rewards everyone equally instead of disproportionately rewarding those who are inclined to cheat. It also benefits and rewards those who are inclined to be socially responsible. Of course, anytime that distribution of goods and information are centralized like this, there is the threat of corruption. So it's important that you have, somebody to watch the watchmen, so to speak. And then also for those people to report back to the public and to provide transparency and an informed public. And if this sheriff proves to be corrupt or just incompetent or for whatever reason the town feels that he's not doing a good job, they need to be able to reassign that position to somebody else. This is the basic structure of democratic socialism. Now, because this system requires a lot of extra people to be in the community, it's going to require not just maintenance of their production, but actual growth. So then the question becomes, how can you go about artificially increasing the production or to cultivate new types of plants that are better and more efficient producers? So now as a community, they face the challenge of how do we incentivize somebody to put in the effort to increase production, which benefits everybody. It's kind of a reverse problem of the tragedy of the commons is one person has to put in a lot of effort for everybody else's good. So how are you going to motivate people to do that? After all, it's not like somebody would go through all the effort of creating a polio vaccine or something and then just give it away to the world for free without making a profit off of it, right? That would be crazy. There needs to be some kind of financial incentive to get people to do these kinds of things. So then, rather than implementing this system, the town decides for a different route. They decide to go with private ownership.